A Werewolf Shifter Romance by Lena, from Lena's Romance Library. Chapter 1. The Cruelest Command. The silver tray trembled in Lyra's hands as she stood outside the great hall's towering oak doors. Beyond them, she could hear the rumble of masculine laughter, the clink of crystal, and the low growls that meant the pack's most powerful alphas were deep in their cups. Tonight was the harvest moon celebration, a night when the hierarchy mattered more than ever, and she was about to walk into the lion's den. "Remember, Omega," Beta Marcus sneered from beside her, his breath reeking of whiskey and malice. "You're to serve the Alpha King personally. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look him in the eyes. And whatever you do, don't drop that wine. It's worth more than your pathetic existence." Lyra's jaw clenched, but she kept her gaze fixed on the polished marble floor. At 23, she'd learned to swallow her pride like bitter medicine. Being the pack's only Omega, a werewolf who couldn't shift, couldn't feel the moon's call, couldn't even sense her own wolf, meant she was less than nothing in their world. She was a cosmic joke, a flawed creation that the moon goddess had apparently forgotten to finish. "The others are betting on how quickly you'll humiliate yourself," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with amusement. "Personally, I give you 30 seconds before you're on your knees, cleaning wine off the Alpha King's boots." The other betas behind him chuckled, and Lyra felt the familiar burn of shame creep up her neck. She'd been serving the pack for 5 years now, ever since her parents died in a rogue attack and left her with nowhere else to go. Every day was a reminder that she didn't belong, that she was a burden they tolerated out of some twisted sense of duty. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the cruelty had an edge to it that made her skin crawl. "Why me?" she whispered, immediately regretting the question when Marcus's eyes flashed with predatory delight. "Because, sweet little broken thing, the Alpha King requested you specifically." His grin widened, showing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "Apparently, he's heard about our pack's famous defective Omega and wants to see the freak for himself." The words hit her like physical blows. Defective. Freak. She'd heard them 1,000 times, but they never stopped cutting deep. The Alpha King, ruler of the Northern Territories, commander of 12 packs, the most powerful shifter in North America, wanted to see her like she was some carnival attraction. "Maybe he'll put you out of your misery," one of the other betas suggested with a laugh. "Do us all a favor." Lyra's hands tightened on the tray until her knuckles went white. The ancient bottle of wine, a 1947 Chateau d'Yquem worth more than most people's cars, seemed to mock her with its elegant curves and golden label. One wrong move, and they'd have another excuse to remind her how worthless she was. The doors swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through her bones. The Kei Great Hall was a testament to old-world power and modern wealth. Massive stone columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of the hunt, while crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. 200 of the most dangerous predators in the supernatural world filled the space, their conversations a symphony of controlled violence and barely leashed power. But it was the figure at the head table that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. Alpha King Kieran Blackthorn sat like a dark god among mortals, his presence so commanding that the very air seemed to bend around him. Even seated, she could tell he was massive. Broad shoulders straining against a perfectly tailored black suit, hands that could probably snap her neck without effort resting casually on the polished wood. His hair was midnight black, swept back from a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by a sculptor who specialized in beautiful nightmares. When he turned his head slightly, catching her scent on the air, Lyra saw eyes the color of winter storms, pale gray with flecks of silver that seemed to glow in the chandelier light. Those eyes found hers across the crowded room, and for a moment, the world went completely still. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. couldn't do anything but stare into depths that seemed to hold secrets older than the mountains themselves. There was something in his gaze, surprise, recognition, hunger, that made her wolfless heart pound against her ribs like a caged bird. "Move," she told herself desperately. "Don't just stand here like an idiot." Somehow, her feet carried her forward through the maze of tables and bodies. Conversations quieted as she passed, and she felt the weight of dozens of stares pressing against her skin. Some were curious, others contemptuous, but all reminded her that she was an anomaly in their perfect predator world. The closer she got to the head table, the more the air seemed to thicken. Power radiated from the Alpha King like heat from a forge, making her skin prickle with awareness. By the time she reached his chair, every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run. Not because she was afraid of him, but because something deep in her soul recognized him as dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with claws and fangs. "Your Majesty," she whispered, proud when her voice didn't shake. She began to pour the wine with steady hands, focusing on the golden liquid instead of the man who seemed to be studying her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. "Look at me." The command was soft, but it hit her with the force of an avalanche. Against every rule she'd been taught, every survival instinct that had kept her alive in this world, Lyra raised her eyes to meet his. The moment their gazes locked, something shifted in the universe. She felt it like a physical thing. A click, a settling, a sense that pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed were suddenly falling into place. The Alpha King's pupils dilated, his nostrils flaring as though he was scenting something that pleased him. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her bones. "Lyra," she managed, surprised she could speak at all. "Lyra Thorne, Your Majesty." Something flickered in his expression. Thorne. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. Around them, the great hall had gone unnaturally quiet, as though the assembled crowd sensed they were witnessing something significant. The Alpha King reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against hers as he took the wineglass from her trembling hands. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, and she had to bite back a gasp. His skin was warm, so much warmer than it should be, and she could swear she felt his pulse sync with hers in that brief moment of contact. "Tell me, Lyra Thorne," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "What do you see when you look at me?" The question was so unexpected, so different from what she'd been prepared for, that honesty slipped past her guard before she could stop it. "I see someone who's tired of being alone." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Lyra immediately wanted to take them back. What had she been thinking? "You didn't psychoanalyze the Alpha King. You didn't speak unless spoken to. You certainly didn't." Kieran Blackthorne smiled. It was barely a curve of lips, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But in that instant, he looked less like a terrifying sovereign, and more like a man who'd forgotten what kindness felt like. The spell broke when someone at a nearby table snorted with laughter. "Did the broken Omega just try to read the Alpha King?" Beta Marcus's voice carried clearly through the hall. "How precious! Next, she'll be offering to read his palm." More laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and cutting. Lyra felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could step back, retreat into the shadows where she belonged, the Alpha King's voice cut through the mockery like a blade. Silence. The single word carried such absolute authority that every laugh died instantly. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees, and Lyra could smell the sudden spike of fear in the air. Kieran Blackthorne rose from his chair with fluid grace, his full height making him tower over everyone nearby. When he spoke again, His voice was deadly quiet. Anyone who finds amusement in mocking my guest will find themselves explaining their humor to me personally. I trust I make myself clear. The threat hung in the air like a drawn sword. Around the hall, heads nodded frantically, and Lyra heard more than one whispered apology carried on the wind. But she barely noticed. She was too busy trying to process what he'd just called her. My guest. Not the Omega. Not the servant. His guest. When Kieran turned back to her, his storm-gray eyes held something that looked almost like protection? "Walk with me," he said, offering her his arm like she was someone who mattered. Lyra stared at the elegant gesture, knowing that accepting it would change everything. Taking the Alpha King's arm would mark her as someone under his protection, someone worthy of notice. It would also paint a target on her back that might never come off. But as she looked up into those pale eyes, seeing depths that called to something broken inside her, she realized she was already lost. With hands that only trembled slightly, she placed her fingers on his arm and let him lead her into a future she couldn't imagine. Behind them, the great hall remained frozen in stunned silence. 200 predators trying to understand how their world had just shifted on its axis. And in the shadows at the back of the room, eyes that burned with jealousy and rage watched the unlikely pair walk away, already planning how to tear them apart. Chapter 2: The Garden of Secrets. The Alpha King's private gardens were a world away from the suffocating tension of the Great Hall. Ancient oak trees formed natural archways overhead, their branches heavy with late autumn leaves that caught the moonlight like scattered copper coins. The air here was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of jasmine and something wild that made Lyra's pulse quicken in ways she didn't understand. Kieran walked beside her in comfortable silence, his hand resting lightly over hers where it curved around his arm. She could feel the warmth of him even through his expensive suit jacket, could sense the controlled power in every measured step. But more than that, she could feel his attention focused entirely on her. Not the dismissive tolerance she was used to, but genuine interest that made her feel simultaneously terrified and cherished. "You're shaking," he observed quietly as they paused beside a fountain carved from black marble. Water cascaded from the mouths of snarling wolves, the sound both soothing and somehow ominous. Lyra tried to pull her hand away, embarrassed by her body's betrayal, but his fingers closed gently over hers, keeping her anchored to his side. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know why." "Don't apologize." His voice held a note of command that brooked no argument. "And don't lie to yourself about why. You feel it too." "Feel what?" The question burned on her tongue, but she didn't dare ask. Because if she was honest, truly honest, she did feel something. A pull, a recognition, a sense that standing next to this dangerous man was the first time in her life she'd been exactly where she belonged. It was impossible, ridiculous, and completely terrifying. "Tell me about yourself, Lyra Thorne." Kieran settled onto the fountain's edge with fluid grace, tugging her gently down beside him. The marble was cool against her legs, but his proximity warmed her more effectively than any fire. "And don't give me the practiced responses you used to survive in that hall. Tell me something. Real." The request caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked about her? Really asked, like her answer mattered. "There's not much to tell," she began carefully. "I'm nobody special, just an Omega who—" "You're not an Omega." The interruption was so matter-of-fact, so certain that it stole her breath. "What?" Lyra stared at him, confusion and something that might have been hope warring in her chest. "Of course I am. I can't shift, can't feel the moon call, can't even—" "You can't shift yet," Kieran corrected, his storm-gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. "There's a difference. I don't understand." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Everyone knows what I am. The pack doctors tested me when I was 16. They said my wolf never developed, that I'm some kind of genetic anomaly. Your pack doctors are fools. There was such conviction in his words that for a moment, she almost believed him. Tell me about your parents. The subject change felt like whiplash. My parents? They died when I was 18. Rogue attack. What were their names? Elena and Marcus Thorne. She frowned, not understanding where this was leading. Why does it matter? Something flickered across Kieran's face. Surprise, recognition. Something that looked almost like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Elena Thorne. Tall woman, silver hair, eyes the color of sea glass. Lyra's heart stuttered. You knew my mother? I knew of her. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. She was born into one of the oldest bloodlines in North America. Ancient magic, Lyra. The kind that doesn't follow normal rules. That's impossible. But even as she said it, fragments of half-remembered conversations flickered through her mind. Her mother's hushed phone calls late at night. The way she'd always known things before they happened. The strange books hidden in the attic that Lyra had never been allowed to read. Your mother left her pack when she was young, Kieran continued, his voice gentle but relentless. Ran away with your father and disappeared into human society. But bloodlines like hers don't just vanish, Lyra. They wait. Wait for what? For the right moment to awaken. The words hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Because if what he was saying was true, if there was more to her story than being the pack's broken omega, then everything she'd believed about herself was a lie. I would have felt something by now, she protested weakly. Some sign, some indication that I was more than, look at me. The command in his voice was impossible to resist. When their eyes met, she saw something in those pale depths that made her breath catch. What do you feel when you look at me, Lyra? And don't give me another deflection. Tell me the truth. The truth. God, the truth was dangerous territory. The truth was that every instinct she possessed was telling her this man was meant to be hers. That despite being the most powerful predator in their world, he looked at her like she was precious. That when he touched her, she felt complete for the first time in her life. I feel... She struggled for words that wouldn't sound insane. Like I've been waiting my whole life to meet you. Like you're the missing piece I didn't know I needed. Kieran's pupils dilated, his nostrils flaring as though her honesty had released some intoxicating scent into the air. Do you know what that feeling is called in our world? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Recognition, the bond that forms between true mates. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. It's supposed to be impossible between an alpha and someone without a wolf. But here we are. True mates. The words should have sounded ridiculous, like something out of the romance novels she used to read in secret. Instead, they felt like coming home. How is that possible? She whispered. I don't know. For the first time since she'd met him, Kieran looked uncertain, vulnerable. I only know that the moment I scented you in that hall, everything inside me went quiet for the first time in decades. The beast that's been clawing at my chest since I took the throne. The rage that's been eating me alive. It all just... stopped. Lyra stared at him, seeing past the crown and the power to the man underneath. A man who carried burdens that would crush most people. A man who'd been alone at the top for so long he'd forgotten what connection felt like. What does this mean? She asked. For us, I mean. Something dark flickered across his features. It means we're about to find out just how many rules fate is willing to break. Before she could ask what he meant by that ominous statement, The sound of footsteps on gravel made them both turn. Beta Marcus appeared at the garden entrance, his expression carefully neutral, but his scent carrying notes of barely controlled aggression. "Your Majesty," he said with a bow that managed to be respectful and mocking at the same time. "Forgive the interruption, but the council is requesting your presence. Something about the territorial disputes in the eastern provinces." Kieran's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Tell the council I'll be with them shortly." "Of course." Marcus's gaze slid to Lyra, and she saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. "And what should I tell them about this situation?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Lyra felt Kieran go very still beside her, Predator recognizing a threat even when it came wrapped in pack politeness. "You should tell them," Kieran said, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Lyra's arms stand up. "That the Alpha King's personal affairs are none of their concern. Unless, of course, you're volunteering to explain to me why they should be." Marcus paled slightly but held his ground. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I simply thought, given the Omega's status within our pack, that clarification might be necessary." "The only clarification necessary," Kieran said, rising to his full imposing height, "is that anyone who harms what belongs to me will answer for it personally. Are we clear?" "What belongs to me?" The possessive declaration should have made Lyra's feminist sensibilities bristle. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through her body and made something deep inside her purr with satisfaction. Marcus nodded stiffly and retreated, but not before shooting Lyra a look that promised retribution. When they were alone again, Kieran turned back to her with an expression that was part apology, part promise. "This won't be easy," he warned. "There are rules, traditions, expectations that we'll be breaking just by being in the same room together. Are you prepared for that?" Lyra thought about the life she'd been living, the daily humiliations, the constant reminders that she was less than nothing, the crushing loneliness that had become her closest companion. Then she looked at this man who saw something in her that no one else had ever bothered to look for. "I've been breaking their rules just by existing," she said quietly. "At least this way, I won't be doing it alone." Kieran's smile was soft and devastating. "No, Lyra Thorne, you'll never be alone again." But as he led her back toward the manor house, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows, or the way those watching eyes glowed with inhuman hunger in the darkness. Chapter 3. Awakening Shadows. The morning light streaming through the tall windows of Kieran's private study did nothing to ease the tension that had settled over the manor like a shroud. Lyra sat curled in an oversized leather chair, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, while the Alpha King paced behind his massive mahogany desk like a caged predator. She'd barely slept after their conversation in the garden. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw storm-gray irises and felt the phantom touch of fingers against her skin. But more than that, she kept replaying his words. True mates, ancient bloodlines, rules fate was willing to break. It all felt like something out of a dream, too impossible to be real, too perfect to last. "You're thinking too loud," Kieran observed without turning around. Even with his back to her, he seemed attuned to every shift in her mood, every flutter of anxiety that crossed her mind. "Sorry." Lyra set down her coffee cup and tucked her legs beneath her. I keep waiting for someone to tell me this is all some elaborate joke. That the broken Omega thinking she could be anything more than a servant was the punchline everyone's been waiting for. Kieran stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression fierce. Don't what? Don't diminish yourself because others have been too blind to see what you are." He moved toward her, with that fluid grace that marked him as apex predator, kneeling beside her chair so they were eye level. "I've ruled for 15 years, Lyra. I've met thousands of wolves, from the strongest alphas to the meekest pack members. I know power when I see it, even when it's sleeping. The conviction in his voice made something flutter in her chest. Then why can't I feel it? If there's really something more to me, why does everything still feel empty? Because trauma can bury gifts as deep as graves. Kieran's hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that should have been impossible after knowing each other for less than 12 hours. Your parents died when you were 18, you said. What happened after that? Lyra's throat tightened. She'd never talked about those dark months with anyone. Not that there'd been anyone to talk to. I had nowhere else to go. Marcus's pack took me in, but they made it clear I was charity, a burden they'd accepted out of duty to my father's memory. And how did they treat you? The question was gentle, but she could hear the dangerous undertone beneath it. Kieran might be holding her hand with tender care, but there was something predatory in the way he waited for her answer. Like what I was, a defective wolf who couldn't contribute anything meaningful to the pack. The old shame tried to creep up her throat, but somehow his presence made it easier to push down. They weren't cruel exactly, just dismissive. Like I was furniture that occasionally needed feeding. A low growl rumbled through Kieran's chest, and his eyes flashed with something that made her pulse quicken. Dismissive, right. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, the gesture soothing even as his voice carried deadly promise. We'll be addressing their treatment of you. Soon. Kieran, no. Lyra's free hand came up to cup his face, surprised by her own boldness. I don't want revenge. I want to understand what this is between us. What it means. His eyes closed at her touch, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. It means everything I thought I knew about destiny just went out the window. When he opened his eyes again, they held a mixture of wonder and something that looked like fear. I stopped believing in fate a long time ago, Lyra. Had to survive what this position demands. But you? What about me? You make me remember what hope feels like. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Lyra felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Really, truly seen by someone who mattered. A sharp knock at the study door shattered the moment. Kieran's expression hardened instantly, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the mask of the Alpha King. Enter, he commanded, not moving away from Lyra but somehow managing to project absolute authority, even while kneeling beside her chair. The door opened to reveal a woman Lyra didn't recognize, tall, elegant, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of beauty that could stop traffic. But it was her scent that made Lyra's hackles rise. Expensive perfume overlaying something wild and predatory that screamed alpha female. Kieran, darling. The woman purred, her ice-blue eyes taking in the intimate scene with obvious displeasure. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Kieran rose to his feet with fluid grace, positioning himself subtly between Lyra and the newcomer. Selena. I wasn't expecting you until next week. Selena Voss. Even Lyra, isolated as she'd been, knew that name. The alpha female of the Western Territories, powerful enough to command her own armies and beautiful enough to grace magazine covers. Rumor had it she'd been angling for a mating contract with Kieran for years. I finished my business in California early and thought I'd surprise you. Selena's gaze slid past Kieran to Lyra, and her smile turned predatory. Though it seems you've found your own surprises. How quaint. The dismissal in that single word made Lyra's cheeks burn. She started to stand, instinctively preparing to excuse herself and retreat to the shadows where she belonged. But Kieran's hand on her shoulder kept her in place. Lyra, I'd like you to meet Selena Voss, Alpha of the Western Pack. His voice was perfectly neutral, but Lyra could feel the tension radiating from him. Selena, this is Lyra Thorne. Thorne? Selena's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Not Elena Thorne's daughter? The question sent a chill down Lyra's spine. You knew my mother? Knew of her. Selena's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Such a tragic story, really. A bloodline that powerful, wasted on someone who chose to play human. And now, here you are, proving that particular apple didn't fall far from the tree. The insult was delivered with such casual cruelty that for a moment Lyra couldn't breathe. But before she could formulate a response, Kieran's voice cut through the room like a blade. That's enough. The temperature in the study seemed to drop 10 degrees. Selena's smile faltered as she took in Kieran's expression, finally recognizing the danger she'd stumbled into. Kieran, I was merely... You were disrespecting my guest in my home. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, something that never happens twice. The threat was unmistakable. Selena's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup, but her eyes, when they fixed on Lyra, burned with newfound hatred. Of course, she said stiffly. My apologies. I didn't realize the... girl was under your protection. Now you do. Kieran's tone suggested the conversation was over. I'm sure you have important matters to attend to. Don't let us keep you. It was a dismissal delivered with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Selena's jaw tightened, but she was too smart to push further. With a nod that managed to be both respectful and seething, she turned toward the door. But at the threshold, she paused. Oh, Kieran. The council meeting has been moved to this afternoon. Something about urgent territorial disputes that require immediate attention. I do hope nothing distracting will keep you from attending. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded more ominous than a slam. She knows, Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. About us, I mean. About whatever this is. Yes. Kieran's jaw was tight with barely controlled anger. And she'll use it against us if she can. Maybe I should go. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. If my being here is going to cause problems for you? No. Kieran was beside her in an instant, his hands framing her face with desperate gentleness. Don't you dare run from this, Lyra. Don't you dare run from us. But what if she's right? What if I really am just a broken girl playing at being something more? Then we'll find out together. His forehead pressed against hers, and she could feel his breath warm against her lips. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Lyra looked into those storm-gray eyes and saw her future reflected there. Uncertain, dangerous, but blazing with possibility. For the first time in her life, someone was asking her to be brave not in spite of what she was, but because of what she might become. Yes, she whispered. I trust you. His smile was soft and devastating. Then we'll weather whatever comes next. But as he pulled her into his arms, neither of them noticed the shadow that lingered outside the study window, or the way it seemed to writhe with malevolent purpose before melting away into the morning sun. The council meeting would indeed prove urgent, but not for the reasons anyone expected. And by nightfall, the fragile peace of the manor would be shattered by truths that some would kill to keep buried. Chapter 4. Blood and Revelations. The council chamber was a monument to old power, stone walls carved with ancient runes, a circular table hewn from a single massive oak, and windows that had witnessed centuries of political maneuvering. But today, the air crackled with tension that felt different, more dangerous than the usual posturing between territorial alphas. Lyra stood in the shadows behind Kieran's chair, her presence a deliberate statement that she refused to acknowledge the whispered objections that had followed them into the room. He'd insisted she attend, claiming he wanted her perspective on pack dynamics. The real reason they both knew was that leaving her alone in the manor felt like painting a target on her back. The situation in the eastern provinces grows more volatile by the day, Beta Commander Hayes was saying, his scarred hands spread across a detailed map. 3 more farms attacked last night. The humans are starting to ask questions we can't answer. Rogues? Asked Alpha Morrison, his weathered face grim. That's what we assumed. Hayes traced a pattern across the map with one finger. But the attack patterns are too coordinated, too purposeful. These aren't random acts of desperation. Kieran leaned forward, his attention laser-focused on the briefing. But Lyra could feel the tension radiating from him, could smell the subtle shift in his scent that spoke of a predator recognizing a larger threat. Survivors? None that lived long enough to give useful testimony. But Hayes hesitated, glancing around the table. The local coroner found something interesting. Bite marks that don't match any known rogue signatures. A chill ran down Lyra's spine. She'd heard whispers about the ancient things that lived in the spaces between civilized packs. Creatures that wore familiar faces but hungered for things that went beyond simple territory or dominance. "Show me," Kieran commanded. Hayes produced a manila folder, sliding photographs across the polished wood. Even from her position behind Kieran's chair, Lyra could see enough to make her stomach lurch. The bite patterns were wrong somehow. Too deep, too precise, like they'd been made by something that understood anatomy in ways that went beyond instinct. "These aren't werewolf marks," Selena observed from across the table, her voice carrying a note of unease that she couldn't quite hide. "The jaw structure is all wrong." "No," agreed Kieran grimly. "They're not." The implications hung in the air like smoke. If rogues weren't responsible for the attacks, then something else was hunting in their territory. Something that killed with the precision of a predator but left behind evidence that didn't match any known species in their world. "There's something else," Hayes continued reluctantly. "The victims, they weren't just killed, they were drained, completely. Like something had pulled the life force right out of their bodies." A collective shiver went through the assembled alphas. Lyra felt her own blood turn cold as fragments of half-remembered bedtime stories flickered through her mind. Tales her mother used to tell about creatures that fed on more than flesh and blood. "Wraiths," she whispered, not realizing she'd spoken aloud until every head in the room turned toward her. The silence was deafening. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then Selena's laugh rang out, sharp and mocking. "Oh, how precious! The broken Omega thinks she can contribute to strategic planning." Her ice-blue eyes glittered with malice. "Tell me, dear, did you read about wraiths in some human fantasy novel?" Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks, but before she could retreat into embarrassed silence, Kieran's voice cut through the mockery like a blade. "Continue, Lyra." His tone brooked no argument from anyone in the room. "What do you know about wraiths?" All eyes were on her now, some curious, others skeptical, but all waiting. Lyra's mouth went dry, but something in Kieran's steady gaze gave her courage to speak. "My mother used to tell me stories," she began hesitantly, "about the old creatures that existed before the packs organized. She said wraiths were spirits that got trapped between worlds, not alive, not dead, but hungry for the life force they'd lost." "Fairy tales," Selena dismissed with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "Are they?" Kieran's question was directed at the room, but his eyes never left Lyra's face. "Commander Hayes, describe the crime scenes again. Specifically, what was taken?" Hayes consulted his notes, frowning. "Well, like I said, the bodies were completely drained. But it wasn't just blood. The victims looked aged, like decades had passed in minutes. And there was this residue on their skin, something that made the local wolves sick just from proximity. Spiritual decay, Lyra said quietly. Mother called it the Grey Death. She said wraiths consumed the essence that kept souls tethered to bodies, leaving behind shells that reality itself rejected. The room had gone completely still. Even Selena's mocking smile had faded as the implications sank in. Assuming you're right, Alpha Morrison said slowly. How do we fight something like that? You don't, Lyra admitted. According to the stories, wraiths can't be killed because they're already dead. They can only be banished back to whatever realm they came from. And how exactly does one banish a creature that exists between worlds? Selena's voice had lost its mocking edge, replaced by something that might have been fear. Lyra opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. Because the truth was, she didn't know. Her mother's stories had always ended with the creatures being driven away by some hero with ancient bloodline gifts. Gifts that supposedly ran in families but manifested differently in each generation. Gifts that might explain why an Omega could recognize threats that seasoned warriors couldn't identify. I don't know, she admitted. The stories always involved bloodline magic, but Mother never explained how it worked. Kieran was studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. What bloodline magic, Lyra? I'm not sure. She called it the old ways. Something about certain families being born to guard the barriers between worlds. Lyra felt foolish saying it, like she was reciting children's tales to adults who dealt in real violence and political strategy. But that's all legend. I'm just a... You're not just anything, Kieran interrupted firmly. Then to the room at large. Commander Hayes, I want patrols doubled along our eastern borders. And send word to the archives. Have them pull everything we have on pre-pack folklore and boundary magic. Sir. Hayes nodded, making notes. The rest of you, return to your territories and brief your people. If these attacks spread, I want early warning systems in place. Kieran's commanding presence filled the room, but Lyra could sense the undercurrent of worry beneath his authoritative exterior. We'll reconvene tomorrow evening to discuss our findings. As the Alphas began filing out, Selena lingered near the doorway. Kieran, might I suggest that relying on children's stories is perhaps not the most effective military strategy? Noted, Kieran replied curtly. Was there something else? Selena's gaze slid to Lyra, and for a moment, something almost like genuine concern flickered in her ice-blue eyes. Just be careful who you trust. Some bloodlines carry more than just gifts. They carry curses, too. The warning sent a chill through Lyra, but before she could ask what Selena meant, the other woman was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and unspoken threats. When they were finally alone, Kieran turned to face Lyra fully, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. You recognized something in those photographs, he said. It wasn't a question. Lyra nodded slowly. The bite patterns. They reminded me of drawings in one of Mother's hidden books. I only saw them once when I was maybe 10 years old, but... She trailed off, struggling to put the feeling into words. But what? But looking at them made something inside me feel... angry. Like I was seeing evidence of a law that had been broken. She met his gaze, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Kieran, what if the stories weren't just stories? What if Mother was preparing me for something I never understood? He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was seeing her for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her heart race. Then we're about to find out just how deep your family's secrets run, and whether the woman I'm falling for is exactly who she appears to be. Falling for. The words sent heat spiraling through her chest, but they were shadowed by the implication that there might be more to her identity than even she realized. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in the darkness between worlds, ancient hungers stirred with renewed purpose. Chapter 5. The Weight of Truth. The Manor's library was a cathedral of knowledge. 3 stories of books reaching toward a painted ceiling that depicted wolves running beneath star-filled skies. Ancient leather-bound tomes shared space with modern research journals, creating a timeline of supernatural scholarship that stretched back centuries. But tonight, surrounded by towers of pulled volumes and scattered papers, Lyra felt more lost than enlightened. "Anything?" Kieran asked from across the massive reading table, his voice rough with exhaustion. They'd been at this for hours, combing through everything the archives had on boundary magic and pre-pack folklore. Nothing concrete. Lyra rubbed her tired eyes, fighting the urge to lean into the warmth radiating from his nearby presence. Lots of references to guardian bloodlines and creatures that feed on life force, but it's all fragments, like someone deliberately scattered the information to make it hard to piece together. Or like someone wanted to erase it entirely. Kieran closed the journal he'd been reading with more force than necessary. 3 different accounts mention the thorn line specifically, but always in passing. Always incomplete. A chill ran down Lyra's spine. What kind of mentions? Here. He slid a yellowed manuscript across the table. This is from 1847, a report about a wraith incursion near the Canadian border. The writer says the creatures were banished by one of the Thorn women, though the method remains unknown to this observer. Lyra stared at the faded ink, her heart hammering against her ribs. My great-great-grandmother, maybe? Maybe. And this one? He produced another document, this one more recent. 1923. A pack in Montana reports unusual spiritual activity that suddenly stopped after the arrival of Elena Thorne and her peculiar methods. My mother, the words came out as barely a whisper. She was there. She actually... God, Kieran, what was she? What are you, more importantly? His voice was gentle, but she could hear the concern underneath. Because if these accounts are accurate, your family doesn't just know about wraiths. You hunt them. The revelation should have felt empowering. Instead, it made her feel hollow, like she'd been living someone else's life without knowing it. But I can't even shift. How am I supposed to fight creatures that exist between worlds? Maybe shifting isn't your gift. Kieran moved around the table, settling in the chair beside her. The gesture was casual, but she could feel the protective energy radiating from him. Maybe your power lies somewhere else entirely. What power? The question came out sharper than she intended, frustration bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. I'm 23 years old, Kieran. If I had some kind of mystical abilities, don't you think I would have noticed by now? Would you? His gray eyes studied her face with that intensity that made her feel stripped bare. Think about it, Lyra. You've spent 5 years with a pack that treated you like you were broken. You've been told every day that you're defective, worthless, less than nothing. If you had gifts trying to manifest, would you have recognized them? Or would you have buried them along with everything else you weren't allowed to be? The words hit like physical blows, forcing her to confront truths she'd been avoiding. Because he was right. She'd been so focused on what she couldn't do, so consumed by the daily struggle of existing in a world that didn't want her, that she'd never looked for signs of what she might actually be capable of. She started to speak, then stopped as memory flickered. There was something. When I was younger. What kind of something? Dreams, visions, maybe. The admission felt dangerous, like she was confessing to crimes she didn't understand. I used to see things before they happened. Nothing dramatic. Just small things. Someone getting hurt, or storms coming, or... She trailed, off, embarrassment heating her cheeks. Or what? Or deaths. The words came out in a rush. I always knew when someone in the pack was going to die. Not how or when exactly, just... I'd see shadows around them. Dark things that seemed to cling to their shoulders. Kieran went very still. What happened to the dreams? They stopped after my parents died. I thought it was just grief, or maybe I'd finally outgrown whatever childish imagination had been causing them. She laughed bitterly. Marcus told me it was all in my head anyway. Said broken wolves sometimes develop delusions to cope with their inadequacy. A low growl rumbled through Kieran's chest, and his scent spiked with anger. Marcus told you that? Among other things. Lyra tried to keep her voice light, but the old wounds still ached. He said a lot of things about what I was and wasn't capable of. And you believed him. I was 18 and alone and desperate for anywhere to belong. The confession tasted like ashes. Of course I believed him. What else was I supposed to do? Kieran was quiet for a long moment, but she could feel the rage building in him like pressure behind a dam. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly calm. What exactly did Marcus say to you, Lyra? The question was simple, but something in his tone made her hesitate. Because she could sense the predator beneath his human facade, could feel the barely leashed violence that came with being an alpha king. And suddenly, she understood that her answer would determine what happened to the pack that had given her shelter, however cold that shelter had been. It doesn't matter, she said quickly. That was years ago. I just want to focus on... It matters to me. His hand found hers across the table, fingers intertwining with desperate gentleness. It all matters to me. Every slight, every cruelty, every moment they made you feel like you were less than what you are. The possessive protectiveness in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it made something deep in her chest purr with satisfaction. For the first time in her life, someone was willing to fight for her, not because she was useful or convenient, but because she mattered to them. He said I was a genetic dead end, she admitted quietly. That my parents' death was probably nature's way of preventing their defective genes from spreading. He said the pack tolerated me out of duty, but that I should never forget I was charity they could withdraw at any time. The temperature in the library dropped 10 degrees. Kieran's eyes flashed with something inhuman, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of the beast that lived beneath his civilized exterior. He said, "What?" The words were whispered, but they carried more menace than any shout. Kieran. He told a grieving 18-year-old girl that her parents deserved to die because she couldn't shift. Each word was delivered with surgical precision. He made you believe you were broken when you were actually awakening to gifts he couldn't understand. We don't know that, Lyra protested weakly. We don't know if any of this is real or just wishful thinking. Don't we? Kieran's free hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. You recognized wraiths from children's stories. You dreamed of deaths before they happened. You make me feel things I thought I'd forgotten how to feel. His forehead pressed against hers, and she could feel his breath warm against her lips. And right now, sitting here with ancient books scattered around us and storm clouds gathering outside, you smell like power awakening, like magic that's been sleeping for too long. I don't know what any of that means, she whispered. It means we're going to find out together. His voice was soft but absolutely certain. And it means Marcus and his pack are going to answer for every moment they made you doubt your worth. Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the library. They both turned toward the tall windows, where lightning split the sky in patterns that looked almost like reaching claws. "That's not a natural storm," Kieran observed grimly. Lyra stared at the unnatural lightning, feeling something deep in her chest respond to the chaotic energy. "No," she agreed quietly. "It's not." As if summoned by her words, a howl rose from the direction of the eastern borders, not the call of a wolf, but something older and hungrier. Something that had been waiting in the spaces between worlds for the barriers to weaken. "They're coming," Lyra said, the words falling from her lips with certainty she didn't understand. Kieran's arm tightened around her. "Then we'd better be ready for them." But as another howl joined the first, echoing across the manor grounds with inhuman hunger, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that, ready or not, the war for their world was about to begin. And somehow, she was going to be at the center of it all. Chapter 6. When Lightning Calls. The first scream shattered the night like breaking glass. Lyra bolted upright in the library chair where she dozed off, her heart hammering as the sound echoed through the manor's stone walls. Beside her, Kieran was already moving, his predatory grace evident even in the darkness as he strode toward the windows. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, struggling to orient herself. The last thing she remembered was studying an ancient text about boundary rituals while Kieran made phone calls to his scouts. Maybe an hour. His voice was grim as he peered through the glass. "The storm's getting worse." Lyra joined him at the window and immediately understood what he meant. The lightning wasn't just unnatural, it was wrong. Instead of jagged bolts, the electricity moved in spirals, creating patterns in the sky that hurt to look at directly. And with each flash, she could swear she saw shapes moving within the light, twisted forms that shouldn't exist in any world she knew. Another scream rang out, closer this time, followed by the sound of splintering wood. "The guards," Kieran said, already moving toward the door. "Something's breached the perimeter." "Wait." The word left Lyra's lips before she'd consciously decided to speak. "Don't go out there." He turned back to her, eyebrows raised. "Lyra, my people are under attack." "I know, but something's wrong. More wrong than just wraiths." She pressed her palms against the cool glass, trying to make sense of the certainty flooding through her. "This feels orchestrated. Like we're being herded." "Herded toward what?" Before she could answer, a new sound joined the chaos outside. A low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate through the manor's foundations. The words were in no language she recognized, but they made her teeth ache and sent chills racing down her spine. "Summoning," she whispered, the knowledge rising from some deep part of her consciousness. Someone's using the storm to tear holes between worlds. Kieran's expression darkened. Who would have that kind of power? "I don't know, but..." Lyra cut herself off as movement in the courtyard below caught her attention. A figure stood in the center of the chaos, arms raised toward the spiraling lightning. Even at this distance, even with the storm distorting everything, she recognized the elegant silhouette. Selena. Kieran moved to stand beside her, his body radiating dangerous heat. "What the hell is she doing?" As if in answer to his question, Selena's voice rose above the wind, her words carrying with unnatural clarity. She was speaking in the same ancient language as the chanting, her tone commanding and utterly without fear. With each syllable, the lightning grew brighter, the tears in reality more pronounced. She's not trying to stop this, Lyra realized with growing horror. She's causing it. A roar shook the manor as something massive tore through one of the barriers between worlds. In the courtyard, Selena lowered her arms and turned toward their window, her face tilted up as though she could see them through the glass and shadows. She was smiling. "We need to get out of here." Kieran said, his hand finding Lyra's and gripping tight. Whatever she's summoning, we don't want to face it trapped in. The library door exploded inward, hanging off its hinges as a creature that defied description flowed into the room. It might have been human once, but now it was something between shadow and flesh, its form shifting and reforming with each movement. Where it touched the ancient books, pages withered and crumbled, as though the thing's very presence was toxic to knowledge and memory. Wraith, Lyra breathed, even as part of her mind noted the differences from the folklore descriptions. This thing was more solid, more here than the stories suggested. The creature's head, or what might have been a head, turned toward them, and Lyra found herself staring into eyes that held depths she couldn't fathom. There was intelligence there, malevolent and hungry, but also something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "Little guardian," a voice whispered directly into her mind, bypassing her ears entirely. "We have been waiting so long for you to awaken." "Get behind me," Kieran commanded, his body already beginning to shift. She could see the change starting, bones lengthening, muscles expanding, fingernails becoming claws. But before his transformation could complete, Lyra stepped forward. She didn't know what made her do it. Some instinct deeper than fear, older than logic. As she moved toward the creature, she felt something inside her chest begin to burn. Not with pain, but with a warmth that spread through her veins like liquid sunlight. "You don't belong here," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The wraith paused, its form flickering like a candle in wind. "You cannot banish us, little one. We are already anchored to this realm." "Are you?" Lyra could feel power building in her, not the raw strength of a shifter, but something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. "Or are you just wearing borrowed flesh?" She raised her hand, not really knowing what she intended to do, and light poured from her fingertips. Not the harsh glare of electricity, but something warm and golden, like concentrated sunlight. The moment it touched the wraith, the creature began to scream. "Impossible," it hissed as its form started to unravel. The bloodline was broken, the knowledge lost. "Apparently not," Lyra said grimly, pushing more power into the light. She could feel it flowing through her now. Not foreign magic, but something that had always been part of her, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The wraith dissolved like smoke, its final shriek echoing through dimensions as it was pulled back to whatever realm had spawned it. In its wake, the library felt cleaner somehow, as though the creature's presence had been a stain that was finally scrubbed away. Lyra swayed on her feet, the sudden absence of power leaving her dizzy and drained. Before she could fall, Kieran's arms were around her, pulling her against his chest with desperate relief. "That was incredible," he murmured into her hair. "You were incredible." "I don't understand what just happened." Her voice was muffled against his shirt, but she made no effort to pull away. His warmth was the only thing keeping her grounded right now. The light, the power. Where did it come from? "From you." His hand stroked her hair with reverent gentleness. "It's been there all along, hasn't it? Waiting for the right trigger?" Before she could respond, Selena's voice drifted through the broken window, carried on wind that still crackled with unnatural energy. "Impressive, little guardian, but that was just the beginning." Kieran's arms tightened protectively around Lyra as they turned toward the courtyard. Selena stood in the same spot, but she was no longer alone. Shadows moved around her, dozens of them, with glowing eyes and forms that shifted between human and something far more predatory. "You see, darling?" Selena called up to them, her voice conversational despite the chaos surrounding her. "I've been planning this reunion for a very long time. ever since I learned what dear Lyra really is." "What does she want?" Lyra whispered. Kieran's jaw was granite hard. "I think we're about to find out." As if summoned by his words, more creatures began pouring through the tears in reality. Not just wraiths now, but things with too many teeth and eyes that burned with inhuman hunger. They gathered around Selena like an army awaiting orders, their combined presence making the air itself feel thick and wrong. The Guardian bloodline was supposed to be extinct. Selena continued, her voice carrying impossible distances. Imagine my surprise when I realized Kieran's little pet was actually the last of the old protectors. Understanding hit Lyra like a physical blow. She planned all of this, the council meeting, the attacks, even bringing us together. A trap, Kieran finished grimly. With you as the prize. Outside, Selena raised her arms again, and the creatures around her began to howl in unison. The sound was wrong on every level, not just noise, but something that attacked the fundamental structure of reality itself. "Time to come down, little guardian," Selena called out. "We have so much to discuss about your family's legacy, and what I intend to do with it." Thunder rolled across the sky, but now Lyra could hear the malevolent intelligence behind it. Whatever Selena was summoning, it was bigger than wraiths, more dangerous than anything the old stories had described. "What do we do?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Kieran's response was to pull her closer, his body a shield between her and the nightmare gathering in their courtyard. "We fight. Together." But as more tears opened in the sky and darker things began to emerge, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that fighting might not be enough. That whatever Selena had planned, it was going to require more from her than simply banishing individual creatures. It was going to require her to become something she'd never imagined she could be. Something her mother had spent her whole life trying to protect her from becoming. Chapter 7. The Price of Power. The manor's corridors had never felt so much like a maze as they did now, with shadows writhing along the walls, and the air itself seeming to thicken with each step. Kieran led the way through passages Lyra hadn't known existed, his hand never leaving hers as they navigated the labyrinth of stone and secrets. "Where are we going?" she whispered, trying to ignore the way the darkness seemed to reach for them with grasping fingers. "The heart of the manor. There's a sanctuary there, warded with protections, older than the pack system." His voice was grim as another inhuman howl echoed through the building. If anywhere can hold against what Selena's summoned, it's there. They rounded a corner and found themselves facing a wall of solid stone. Lyra opened her mouth to ask if they'd taken a wrong turn, but Kieran pressed his palm against what looked like ordinary granite. Ancient symbols flared to life under his touch, pulsing with silver light that made her eyes water. "Guardian blood," he explained as the wall began to shift, stones grinding apart to reveal a hidden passage. "The manor was built by your ancestors, Lyra, designed to respond to your family's magic." The revelations stole her breath. "My ancestors built this place? 3 centuries ago. Your great-great-grandmother Elena, the first Elena, she was the one who established the territorial boundaries we still use today. She was also the one who created the wards that have kept darker things from crossing into our world." His gray eyes met hers as they stepped through the opening. "Until tonight." The passage beyond was narrow but lined with more of the glowing symbols. As they walked, Lyra could feel something responding to her presence. Not just the wards, but something deeper. The very stones seemed to recognize her, welcoming her home to a place she'd never known she belonged. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "If you knew what I was, what my family had built here, why keep it secret?" Kieran stopped walking, turning to face her in the silver-lit corridor. "Because I didn't know. Not for certain." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with desperate tenderness. I suspected something when you recognized the wraith evidence. But guardian bloodlines were supposed to be myth, legend. I never imagined. That you'd fall for one of them? The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying years of self-doubt and the terrible hope that maybe, just maybe, someone could see worth in her. That I'd find the other half of my soul hiding in plain sight. His voice was rough with emotion she'd never heard from him before. Lyra, what I feel for you, it's not just attraction or political convenience. You make me whole in ways I didn't know I was broken. The confession hung between them like a bridge, beautiful and terrifying. She could step across it, could let herself believe that someone as powerful as Kieran could truly want someone as ordinary as her. Or she could retreat into the safety of self-doubt, where disappointment couldn't touch her. Before she could decide, the passage shuddered around them. Dust rained from the ceiling as something massive struck the manor above, and the protective symbols flickered like candles in wind. She's testing the outer defenses, Kieran said grimly. We need to reach the sanctuary before... The lights went out. Not the silver glow of the wards, that remained, though dimmer than before. But the electric lighting throughout the manor died in an instant, plunging the world above into darkness that felt thick and hungry. Now would be good, Lyra said, fighting to keep fear out of her voice. They ran through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they should, past doorways that opened onto rooms filled with impossible geometries. The deeper they went, the more Lyra could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on them. This wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a fortress, built to withstand sieges that had nothing to do with conventional warfare. Finally, they emerged into a circular chamber that took her breath away. The walls were covered in murals depicting the history she'd never known, her ancestors standing against creatures of shadow and flame, their hands glowing with the same golden light she'd summoned in the library. At the center of the room, a pool of water reflected starlight that couldn't possibly be coming from above. The scrying pool, Kieran explained, his voice reverent. Your family used it to monitor the barriers between worlds, to know when something was trying to cross over. Lyra approached the pool cautiously, drawn by something she couldn't name. The moment her reflection appeared in the still water, the surface began to ripple. Images formed in the depths, not reflections, but visions. She saw Selena in the courtyard above, her arms raised as she conducted some kind of ritual. Dark energy poured from her fingers, weaving patterns in the air that made reality itself seem to bend and warp. Around her, the creatures she'd summoned were growing stronger, their forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. But it was the figure standing behind Selena that made Lyra's blood freeze. Tall, elegant, with silver hair and eyes the color of winter ice. A woman who looked exactly like the paintings of the first Elena Thorne that lined the walls of this chamber. That's impossible, she whispered. What is it? Kieran moved to stand beside her, following her gaze into the pool. When he saw what she was seeing, his face went pale. That woman with Selena is my ancestor. The Elena who built this place. Lyra's voice was barely audible. But she died 300 years ago. In the vision, the Elena thing turned toward the pool as though she could see them watching. When she smiled, her teeth were too sharp, too white, and her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries spent in places where sanity went to die. Hello, little descendant. Her voice whispered directly into Lyra's mind. Did you really think death could stop a guardian? We are bound to this realm by more than flesh and blood. It's not her, Kieran said fiercely, his arm wrapping around Lyra's waist. Whatever that thing is, it's not your ancestor. Isn't it? The Elena thing's laugh was like breaking glass. I am everything she was, everything she knew, everything she sacrificed to keep the barriers strong. And now, thanks to dear Selena, I'm finally free to reclaim what was stolen from me. The vision shifted, showing them the truth behind Selena's betrayal. Years of research, of searching for a way to breach the ancient wards. The discovery that guardian magic could be corrupted, twisted into something that opened doors rather than sealed them. And finally, the realization that she needed a living guardian to complete her work. You see, child, the Elena thing continued, the protections your bloodline created can only be undone by your bloodline. Selena found me in the spaces between worlds, offered me a chance at vengeance against those who bound me to eternal service. All I had to do was wait for the last guardian to awaken her power. Understanding hit Lyra like a physical blow. The wraith in the library, you let me banish it. I let you practice, the creature agreed. Your light is strong, little one, but untrained. Raw. Perfect for my purposes. What purposes? Kieran demanded, his voice carrying alpha authority that should have been impossible to ignore. The Elena thing's smile widened. To tear down every barrier between worlds, to let chaos flow freely across all realms, and to finally claim the power that should have been mine from the beginning. The pool's surface went black, cutting off the vision and leaving them in the silver glow of the ancient wards. But Lyra could still feel those winter ice eyes watching her, could sense the malevolent intelligence that had been wearing her ancestor's face. She's not wrong about one thing, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. Guardian magic can only be undone by guardian magic. If she's found a way to corrupt the protections, then I'm the only one who can stop her. We'll find another way, Kieran said immediately. There has to be. There isn't. Lyra turned in his arms, memorizing the fierce protectiveness in his storm gray eyes. This is what I was born for, Kieran. What my bloodline has always existed to do. Not alone. His hands framed her face with desperate gentleness. Whatever you're planning, whatever this requires, we face it together. Above them, something roared with enough force to shake dust from the ancient stones. The wards flickered again, their silver light dimming as the corrupted Elena thing tested their strength. She's coming, Lyra whispered, feeling the truth of it in her bones. And when she gets here, one of us isn't leaving this room alive. Kieran's response was to pull her against his chest, his arms a fortress around her trembling form. Then we'd better make sure it's her. But as the sanctuary shuddered under another assault, and darkness pressed against the failing wards like hungry tide, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that stopping her corrupted ancestor was going to require a sacrifice none of them were prepared to make. The price of guardian magic, she was beginning to understand, had always been paid in blood. And tonight, it would be her turn to pay it. Chapter 8. Blood and silver. The sanctuary walls groaned under another assault, ancient stone cracking as something massive threw itself against the outer wards. Each impact sent tremors through the floor, and Lyra could see hairline fractures spreading across the murals of her ancestors, their painted faces seeming to watch her with expressions of grim acceptance. "How long will the protections hold?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady as another bone-jarring impact shook the chamber. Kieran studied the silver light that pulsed weakly along the walls, his expression growing more grim by the moment. Not long. These wards were designed to keep things out, not to withstand a direct assault from someone who knows their weaknesses. As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the surface of the scrying pool, and their breath misted in air that had been warm moments before. The silver wards flickered like dying flames, and shadows pressed against them from the other side. Shadows with eyes that burned with inhuman hunger. "She's here," Lyra whispered, feeling the corrupted presence of her ancestor like ice water in her veins. The largest of the murals, one depicting the first Elena Thorne sealing a dimensional rift, began to ripple like water. The painted figure turned its head, stepping out of the two-dimensional surface with fluid grace that defied every law of physics Lyra had ever known. But this wasn't the noble guardian from the history books. The thing wearing Elena's face was beautiful in the way that avalanches were beautiful, devastating, and absolutely without mercy. Her silver hair moved as though underwater, and when she smiled, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "Hello, little descendant." Her voice carried the echo of centuries, each word layered with whispers from the spaces between worlds. "You've grown into your power beautifully. I can smell it on you, raw potential just waiting to be shaped." "You're not Elena Thorne," Lyra said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You're something else wearing her face." "I am everything she was, and more." The creature's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. Every memory, every skill, every drop of guardian blood that once flowed through her veins. Death simply refined me. Kieran moved to stand slightly in front of Lyra, his body radiating protective menace. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. What was denied to me in life." Those winter ice eyes fixed on Lyra with predatory focus. "To break free from the chains of duty that bound our bloodline to eternal service." "Do you know what it's like, child, to spend 3 centuries trapped between worlds? To watch as lesser beings claim territories that should be yours by right?" "The barriers exist for a reason," Lyra said, though part of her couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to carry that kind of burden. Without them, chaos would be freedom. The corrupted Elena began to circle them, her movement hypnotic and utterly wrong. The pack system, the territories, the rigid hierarchies, all of it built on the backs of guardian sacrifice. Your ancestors bled to create this order, and what did they receive in return? Exile, secrecy. The knowledge that their own descendants would be raised ignorant of their true heritage. Each word hit like a physical blow because they carried the weight of truth. Lyra had been raised in ignorance, had spent years believing she was broken when she'd actually been the inheritor of power beyond imagination. "That doesn't justify what you're doing," she said, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Doesn't it?" The creature stopped directly in front of them, close enough that Lyra could see the frost forming on her pale skin. "Tell me, little guardian, when you banished that wraith, how did it feel? The power flowing through you, the certainty that you were finally becoming what you were meant to be." Lyra's throat tightened. Because the truth was, it had felt incredible. For those few moments, she'd been completely whole, completely herself in ways she'd never experienced before. "I see you remember." The corrupted Elena's smile widened. "That rush of power, that sense of rightness, that's your birthright, child. Not this half-life of ignorance and suppression you've been living." "Don't listen to her," Kieran said urgently, his hand finding Lyra's and gripping tight. "Power without purpose is just destruction." "And what purpose has the pack system served?" The creature shot back. "Endless territorial disputes? Political machinations that leave the innocent suffering? At least chaos is honest about its nature." She raised her hand, and the air around them began to shimmer with dark energy that made Lyra's skin crawl. "Join me, descendant. Help me tear down the barriers your ancestors built, and I'll teach you to wield power they never dreamed of. Together, we can reshape all the worlds according to our will." The offer hung in the air between them, terrible and tempting. Because part of Lyra, the part that had spent years being dismissed, belittled, treated like she was less than nothing, wanted to say yes, wanted to embrace the power that could make her untouchable. But then she looked at Kieran, saw the fierce protectiveness in his storm-gray eyes, and remembered what it felt like to be seen as valuable, just for who she was. Not for what she could do or destroy, but for the person she'd chosen to become, despite everything that had been done to her. "No," she said quietly. The corrupted Elena's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room plummeted another 20 degrees. "I'm disappointed, child, but not surprised. Your mother made the same choice, ran away from responsibility, hid from power, raised you to be weak and compliant." "My mother raised me to be kind," Lyra corrected, feeling warmth beginning to build in her chest despite the supernatural cold. "To think before I act, to consider consequences beyond myself. Kindness is a luxury the powerful can't afford." Dark energy swirled around the creature's fingers like liquid shadow. "But perhaps a demonstration will change your perspective." She gestured toward Kieran, and he doubled over with a scream that tore through Lyra's soul. Black veins spread across his skin like poison, and his eyes rolled back to show only whites as whatever the corrupted Elena was doing ate him alive from the inside. "Stop!" Lyra lunged forward, but invisible force slammed her back against the chamber wall. "I'm simply showing you what happens to those who stand between guardians and their destiny," the creature said conversationally, even as Kieran writhed in agony at her feet. "He's strong, I'll give him that. Most alphas would be dead by now." Golden light exploded from Lyra's hands, driven by rage and desperation that burned away everything else. The corrupted Elena staggered back, her hold on Kieran breaking as she raised her own defenses against the assault. "Impressive," she panted, though her winter ice eyes glittered with something that might have been approval. "Raw, unfocused, but impressively powerful. You really are my descendant." Lyra helped Kieran to his feet, feeling him lean heavily against her as the black veins faded from his skin. "Are you all right?" "I'll live," he managed, though his voice was rough with pain. "But she's right about one thing. You're stronger than you know. Strong enough to tear down barriers that have protected reality for centuries," the corrupted Elena added helpfully. "Strong enough to reshape the world according to your will. The only question is whether you'll do it willingly, or whether I'll have to break you first." The sanctuary shuddered again, but this time the impact came from within. The scrying pool began to boil, its surface reflecting not the chamber around them, but something else entirely. A vast space filled with swirling darkness and the glowing eyes of creatures that had never known sunlight. "My reinforcements are arriving," the creature said pleasantly. "Ancient things that have been waiting in the void between worlds for a chance at freedom. They're quite eager to meet you, little guardian." As shapes began to emerge from the pool's impossible depths, Lyra realized their sanctuary had become a trap. They were outnumbered, outpowered, and rapidly running out of options. But looking at Kieran, battered but determined to stand between her and harm, she also realized something else. She wasn't just fighting for the world anymore. She was fighting for the chance at the life she'd never dared to dream she could have. And that was worth any sacrifice. Even if it meant becoming the very thing her corrupted ancestor wanted her to be. "Get ready," she whispered to Kieran, golden light beginning to build around her hands again. "This is going to get ugly." His smile was fierce and loving and absolutely without fear. "Ugly's my specialty." As the first of the void creatures pulled itself free of the scrying pool, Lyra embraced the power that had been sleeping in her blood for 23 years, and prayed it would be enough. Chapter 9. The Choice Between Worlds. The void creatures that poured from the scrying pool were nightmares given form. amalgamations of shadow and hunger that moved with predatory intelligence. Some had too many limbs, others had faces in impossible places, but all of them shared one common trait: eyes that burned with the cold fire of things that had never known the warmth of any sun. Lyra's golden light carved through the first wave like a sword through silk, but for every creature she banished, two more emerged from the roiling darkness of the pool. Beside her, Kieran fought with the fluid grace of an apex predator, his partially shifted form allowing him claws that could tear through supernatural flesh. But even his alpha strength was beginning to falter against the endless tide. "There are too many," he said through gritted teeth as another creature's claws raked across his shoulder, leaving wounds that smoked with otherworldly toxins. "I know." Lyra pushed more power into her light, feeling something deep in her chest begin to burn with the effort. "But I don't know how to stop them from coming." "You do know," the corrupted Elena said from her position near the chamber's entrance, her voice carrying easily over the sounds of battle. "You've always known. The pool responds to guardian blood, little descendant. It opens at your command, and it closes at your command." The implication hit Lyra like a physical blow. "You want me to seal it. I want you to choose." Those winter ice eyes glittered with malevolent amusement. "Seal the pool and trap yourself in here with me, or let my friends continue to pour through until they overwhelm everything you claim to care about." Another wave of creatures surged from the darkness, and this time Lyra couldn't stop them all. One of the things, something that looked like a spider made of crystallized screams, managed to get past her defenses. Its claws were inches from Kieran's throat when golden fire erupted from her hands with enough force to shake the ancient stones. The creature dissolved, but the effort left her swaying on her feet. She was burning through power faster than she could replenish it, and they both knew it. "The choice is simple," the corrupted Elena continued conversationally, as though they weren't fighting for their lives. "Embrace your heritage and help me tear down the barriers between worlds, or watch everything you love die while you exhaust yourself trying to hold back the inevitable." "There's a third option," Kieran said grimly, catching one of the creatures by the throat and crushing it with alpha strength. "We take you down first, then deal with your pets." The corrupted Elena laughed, a sound like winter wind through a cemetery. "Oh, my dear Alpha, you still don't understand what you're dealing with, do you?" She raised her hand, and the air around Kieran began to shimmer with the same dark energy that had nearly killed him before. But this time, instead of attacking him directly, she turned her power on the sanctuary itself. Ancient stones began to crack and crumble, their protective wards failing as centuries of accumulated magic was corrupted and turned against them. "This place was built with guardian blood and guardian sacrifice," she said as chunks of ceiling began to rain down around them. "It responds to guardian will. And right now, my will is stronger than yours." The murals on the walls began to shift and writhe, the painted figures stepping free of their two-dimensional prisons. But these weren't the noble ancestors Lyra had admired. They were twisted versions, their faces bearing expressions of bitter resentment and ancient hunger. "All the guardians who came before," the corrupted Elena explained as her army of predecessors surrounded them. "All those who sacrificed their lives to maintain the barriers, who died unknown and unmourned for the greater good. They're here now, child, and they're very, very angry." One of the painted figures, a woman who looked disturbingly like Lyra's mother, stepped forward with jerky, unnatural movements. When she spoke, her voice was layered with centuries of suppressed rage. "You could have been so much more," she said, her words directed at Lyra but her empty eyes fixed on some distant point. "We all could have been so much more. Instead, we chose duty, chose sacrifice, chose to let the world forget we ever existed." "That's not true," Lyra said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. You chose to protect people, to keep the barriers strong. We chose to be slaves, the painted woman shot back. Slaves to a system that ground us to dust and called it noble. More of the twisted ancestors pressed closer, their voices joining in a chorus of bitter accusation that made Lyra's head spin. They spoke of power denied, of lives unlived, of the terrible price their bloodline had paid for the world's peace. And the worst part was, Lyra could feel the truth in their words, could sense the weight of all that accumulated sacrifice, all that unacknowledged suffering. Her ancestors hadn't been heroes in the traditional sense. They'd been martyrs, dying in obscurity so others could live in ignorance. "Don't listen to them," Kieran said urgently, his hand finding hers despite the chaos surrounding them. "These aren't your ancestors. They're corrupted echoes, puppets dancing to her tune." "Are they?" Lyra looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw her own doubt reflected there. "Or are they finally telling the truth about what Guardian legacy really means?" "It means what you make it mean," he said fiercely. "Not what she wants it to mean, not what the past wants it to mean. What you choose." The corrupted Elena clapped slowly, mockingly. How touching. The Alpha thinks love can overcome destiny. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell me, little descendant, what happens to your precious Alpha when the void creatures reach the upper levels? When they tear through the manor and spill out into the world beyond?" As if summoned by her words, screams echoed from somewhere above them. Human voices raised in terror as the creatures that had already escaped began their rampage. Lyra felt each cry like a physical wound, knowing that people were dying because she couldn't make herself choose between impossible options. "Stop this," she whispered, feeling tears she didn't remember shedding burn tracks down her cheeks. "Please. They're innocent." "No one is innocent," the corrupted Elena replied coldly. "The pack system is built on violence and domination. The humans live in willful ignorance of the supernatural forces that shape their world. They all bear responsibility for the suffering of our bloodline." "That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time anyone thanked a guardian for their sacrifice? When was the last time the world even acknowledged that we existed?" The creature's voice rose with genuine passion now, and Lyra caught a glimpse of the woman Elena Thorne had once been, brilliant, powerful, and utterly alone. "We bled for their peace, and they forgot our names before our bodies were cold." The painted ancestors pressed closer, their voices joining in a lament that seemed to come from the very stones of the sanctuary. And despite everything, Lyra found herself understanding their pain, found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, they had a point. "She's in your head," Kieran said urgently, his free hand coming up to cup her face. "Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're thinking, it's not really you." "How do you know?" The question tore itself from her throat. "How do you know this isn't exactly who I was always meant to be?" His answer was to kiss her. Not gentle, not tentative, but fierce and desperate and full of everything he couldn't put into words. And in that moment, with his lips against hers and his arms around her trembling form, the voices of her corrupted ancestors faded to whispers. When they broke apart, his eyes were blazing with certainty that cut through all her doubts. "Because I know who you are, Lyra Thorne. Not what your bloodline makes you. Not what your power demands of you. Who you choose to be moment by moment, choice by choice." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "And the woman I love would never let innocent people die just to ease old pain. The woman I love." The words hit her like lightning, burning away the fog of confusion and resentment that had been clouding her judgment. Because he was right, regardless of what her ancestors had suffered, regardless of what powers flowed in her blood, she was still herself. Still the woman who chose kindness over cruelty, protection over revenge. "You're right," she said, quietly, feeling power begin to build in her chest again. Not the raw, unfocused energy from before, but something more controlled, more purposeful. "I know exactly who I am." The corrupted Elena's expression shifted, surprise replacing smug confidence as she sensed the change in the chamber's emotional atmosphere. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Lyra smiled and for the first time since this nightmare began, felt completely at peace with her choice. "Something my ancestors never got the chance to do," she said as golden light began to pour from her skin like concentrated sunlight. "I'm rewriting the rules." Chapter 10. Rewriting Destiny. The golden light that poured from Lyra's skin wasn't the same desperate energy she'd wielded before. This was something deeper, more fundamental, power that came not from anger or fear, but from absolute certainty about who she was and what she stood for. The corrupted ancestors recoiled from it as though it burned them, their painted forms beginning to fade back into the walls. "Impossible," the corrupted Elena breathed, her winter ice eyes wide with something that might have been fear. "You can't simply choose to ignore your bloodline's nature." "Can't I?" Lyra stepped forward, and where her feet touched the ancient stones, cracks of pure light spread outward like spiderwebs. "You keep talking about destiny and heritage like they're chains that bind me. But what if they're not? What if they're just starting points?" The void creatures pressing in from all sides began to slow, their forms becoming less solid as her light touched them. But instead of banishing them back to whatever realm they'd come from, something else was happening. The creatures were changing. The hunger in their burning eyes was being replaced by something softer, more recognizable. Confusion, wonder, and underneath it all, a desperate longing that spoke of eons spent in darkness. "What are you doing to them?" Kieran asked, his voice filled with awe. "Giving them what they've always wanted," Lyra said simply. "A choice." The nearest creature, the thing that had looked like a spider made of crystallized screams, was transforming before their eyes. Its too many limbs were retracting, its impossible angles softening into something almost human. When it finally spoke, its voice was hoarse with disuse but recognizably female. I remember," it whispered, looking down at hands that had once been claws. "I remember sunlight. I remember my name." "No!" The corrupted Elena's voice cracked like a whip across the chamber. "They belong to the void! They chose darkness!" "Did they?" Lyra turned to face her ancestor, and the corrupted woman actually took a step back. Or were they just lost for so long they forgot there was another way? More of the void creatures were changing, their monstrous forms melting away to reveal the souls trapped beneath. Some had been human once. Others were clearly from different species. Entirely. Shifters. Fae. Beings Lyra couldn't identify, but could recognize as fundamentally alive in ways that mattered more than classification. "You're breaking the fundamental laws of existence," the corrupted Elena said, but her voice carried less certainty than before. "Power corrupts. Pain hardens hearts. The void claims what the void claims. Only if you let it." Lyra's light grew brighter, and now even the scrying pool was beginning to change. Instead of roiling darkness, its surface showed glimpses of other realms. Not the twisted spaces between worlds, but places of beauty and wonder that spoke of infinite possibility. The void only has power over those who believe they belong there. The painted ancestors were fully corporeal now, but they no longer moved with jerky, unnatural motions. Instead, they stood with the dignity of people who had finally remembered their true purpose. The woman who looked like Lyra's mother stepped forward, her expression soft with wonder. "Child," she said, and her voice carried the warmth of someone who had chosen love over bitterness. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Lyra admitted. I remembered what Kieran told me, that I get to choose who I am, moment by moment. And I realized that if that's true for me, it has to be true for everyone. Even you. Even them." She gestured toward the transformed void creatures, who were helping each other stand on unsteady but increasingly human legs. "The barriers," the corrupted Elena started to protest. "We'll still be there," Lyra interrupted, "but they'll be maintained by choice, not sacrifice. By people who understand that protection comes from love, not duty." The corrupted Elena's perfect composure finally cracked. "You don't understand what you're doing. The chaos, the destruction, it's necessary. The old ways failed." "The old ways assumed that goodness had to come at the cost of happiness," Lyra said gently. "That protecting others meant destroying yourself. But what if it doesn't have to be that way? What if we can choose differently?" She held out her hand to her corrupted ancestor, golden light flowing between her fingers like liquid warmth. "What if you can choose differently?" For a moment, Elena Thorne, the real Elena, the woman who had spent centuries consumed by bitterness and rage, was visible beneath the corruption. Her face crumpled with the weight of all that accumulated pain, all those years of believing she'd been abandoned by everyone she'd sworn to protect. "I'm so tired," she whispered, and suddenly she looked less like a monster and more like what she'd always been, a woman who had carried too much for too long with no one to help her bear the weight. "Then rest," Lyra said simply. "Your job is done. You can let go now." The corrupted Elena took a step toward the offered light, then another. But just as her fingertips were about to touch Lyra's, her expression hardened again. "No," she said, and the temperature in the chamber plummeted. "I won't be denied my revenge, not when I'm so close." Dark energy exploded from her hands, but instead of aimed at Lyra, it was directed at Kieran. The Alpha King had just enough time to look surprised before the corrupted magic slammed into him, sending him flying across the chamber to impact the wall with sickening force. "Kieran!" Lyra's light flared with protective fury as she rushed to his side. He was alive but barely conscious, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue on impact. "Now you understand," the corrupted Elena said with vicious satisfaction. "This is what attachment gets you. This is why guardians must stand alone." But as Lyra cradled Kieran's head in her lap, feeling his warm breath against her hands and seeing the fierce love in his storm-gray eyes even through his pain, she realized something the corrupted Elena had never learned. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "Standing alone doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you alone." The golden light that poured from her now was different again. Not just her power, but something shared. Because Kieran was sharing his strength with her, his alpha energy flowing through their bond to amplify her guardian abilities. And beyond that, she could feel the support of the transformed ancestors, the rescued void creatures, even the ancient stones of the sanctuary itself. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. She never had to fight alone again. "Together," Kieran whispered, struggling to sit up despite his injuries. "Whatever this costs, we face it together." The corrupted Elena screamed with rage and launched herself at them, winter ice claws extended and murder in her eyes. But she never reached them. Because Lyra's light, amplified by love and choice, and the shared strength of everyone in the chamber, met her halfway. What happened next would reshape the supernatural world forever. And it would all begin with a simple truth that had taken Lyra 23 years to learn. Sometimes the most powerful magic wasn't about what you could destroy, but about what you chose to save. Including the parts of yourself you thought were beyond redemption. The final battle wasn't just beginning, it was already won. They just had to live through proving it. Chapter 11. The Light That Heals. When the corrupted Elena's claws met Lyra's light, the collision sent shockwaves through dimensions that had been stable for millennia. But instead of the destructive explosion everyone expected, something miraculous happened. The darkness that had consumed Elena Thorne for 3 centuries began to burn away like morning mist before the sun. The creature that had worn her ancestor's face for so long let out a scream that wasn't rage or pain, but something far more devastating. The sound of someone who had forgotten what hope felt like suddenly remembering. The winter ice of her eyes began to crack and thaw, revealing depths that held not malevolence, but centuries of accumulated grief. What have I done? The words came out broken, horrified, as Elena's true consciousness surfaced for the first time since her corruption. She stared at her hands, still pale as marble but no longer radiating that terrible cold, as though she couldn't quite believe they belonged to her. "You survived," Lyra said gently, still cradling Kieran against her chest as golden light continued to pour from her skin. "In the only way you knew how. But you don't have to survive anymore. You can live." Around the chamber, the rescued void creatures and transformed ancestors watched in amazement as the last of the corruption burned away from their former tormentor. The scrying pool, no longer a gateway to twisted realms, reflected clear starlight that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But the barriers," Elena whispered, her voice fragile as spun glass. "Without the old protections, without the blood sacrifice, we'll be stronger than they've ever been," Lyra interrupted, "because they'll be maintained by choice instead of compulsion, by love instead of duty." To demonstrate, she reached out with her power toward the sanctuary's failing wards. But instead of simply repairing them, she did something that had never been attempted in Guardian history. She opened them to every soul in the chamber, offering each person the chance to contribute their own strength to the protective barriers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Elena's purified magic flowed into the wards, followed by the grateful energy of every creature Lyra had saved from the void. The transformed ancestors added their own power, freely given instead of demanded. Even Kieran, injured as he was, contributed his alpha strength to the growing network of protection. But it was what happened next that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. From throughout the manor, from across the territories, even from distant packs that shouldn't have been able to sense what was happening, more power began to flow into the network. Wolves who had never heard of guardians, humans who lived their entire lives unaware of the supernatural world, even some of the creatures that existed in the spaces between, all of them responding to the invitation to help protect the world they shared. "How is this possible?" Elena asked, wonder replacing the last traces of bitterness in her voice. "Because protection was never supposed to be the burden of a single bloodline," Lyra realized, understanding flooding through her as the network of shared guardianship expanded beyond anything the old ways had ever imagined. It was supposed to be everyone's responsibility. We just forgot how to ask for help. Kieran shifted in her arms, his injuries healing faster than they should have been possible even for an alpha. The golden light surrounding them was working on him too, knitting bone and mending torn tissue with gentle efficiency. "The mate bond," he said softly, his storm-gray eyes wide with realization. "It's not just emotional anymore. You're sharing your guardian abilities with me. And you're sharing your alpha strength with me." Lyra's voice was filled with wonder as she felt the connection between them solidify into something that transcended simple attraction, or even love. "We're balanced. Complete." Elena stepped closer, her expression thoughtful as she studied the energy flowing between them. "In all my research into Guardian lore, I I never found references to anything like this. The bloodline was always portrayed as solitary, isolated by the very power that defined us. Maybe that was the problem, Lyra suggested. Maybe we were never supposed to be alone. As if to prove her point, the sanctuary around them began to change. The ancient stones that had stood for centuries were transforming, their surfaces becoming transparent as crystal, while somehow remaining solid and protective. Through the translucent walls, they could see the manor above, no longer under attack, but filled with people working together to repair the damage caused by the void creature's rampage. Wolves and humans side by side, sharing tools and strength without question. Some of the transformed creatures using their unique abilities to help with tasks that would have been impossible for purely physical beings. Even Selena was there, her ice-blue eyes filled with something that might have been shame as she helped tend to the injured. She was working with me willingly, Elena admitted, following Lyra's gaze. I promised her power, influence, a chance to reshape the supernatural world according to her vision. But seeing what we almost destroyed... She trailed off, shaking her head. Some bargains aren't worth keeping. Everyone deserves a chance to choose differently, Lyra said, echoing the lesson that had transformed this entire nightmare into something approaching hope. Even her. Even you. The scrying pool began to glow with soft light, its surface showing not visions of distant realms, but something far more precious. Possibilities. Futures where the barriers between worlds were maintained by cooperation instead of sacrifice. Where guardians worked alongside rather than apart from the communities they protected. Where power was shared rather than hoarded, and no one had to stand alone against the darkness. I should go, Elena said quietly. Make what amends I can for the damage I've caused. There are others like me. Corrupted souls who have spent too long believing revenge was the only option available to them. You don't have to go alone, Lyra offered. The network we've created, it extends to everyone who chooses to be part of it. You'll have support, guidance, people who understand what you've been through. Elena's smile was soft and genuine, the first truly peaceful expression she'd worn in centuries. Thank you, little descendant, for showing me that redemption was possible even when I'd given up believing in it. She moved toward the transformed scrying pool, but paused at its edge to look back at Lyra and Kieran. The old prophecies spoke of a guardian who would either save or destroy the world, she said. I spent so long believing I was meant to be the destroyer that I never considered the alternative. But you found a third option. What's that? Lyra asked. You chose to transform it instead. Elena stepped into the pool's light and dissolved like morning mist, her presence fading but her gratitude lingering in the air like a blessing. Alone at last, Lyra and Kieran sat in comfortable silence as the golden light gradually faded from her skin. The sanctuary around them was no longer a fortress designed to keep the world at bay, but a meeting place where different realms could coexist peacefully. So, Kieran said eventually, his voice carefully casual despite the earth-shattering events they'd just lived through. What do we do now? Lyra considered the question, feeling the weight of new responsibilities but also the strength of the network supporting her. She was still a guardian, would always carry the power and purpose of her bloodline. But she was also Lyra Thorne, the woman who had chosen love over duty, cooperation over isolation. The woman who had found her mate in the most powerful alpha in North America and somehow made that work too. Now, she said, turning in his arms to face him fully, we build something better than what came before. Together. His kiss was soft and full of promise, tasting of shared strength and infinite possibilities. And as the first rays of actual dawn began to filter through the crystal walls of the sanctuary, Lyra realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what the future might hold, because whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Chapter 12. Dawn of a New Age. 3 months later, the transformed sanctuary had become the heart of something unprecedented in supernatural history. A true alliance between all the beings who shared the hidden world. What had once been Elena's private fortress now served as neutral ground where werewolf alphas sat across negotiating tables from Fey nobility, where human scholars worked alongside vampire researchers, and where creatures from a dozen different realms contributed their unique perspectives to problems that had plagued their world for millennia. Lyra stood at the great crystal windows, watching the sun rise over gardens that now bloomed with impossible flowers, gifts from grateful Fae who had been among the first to embrace the new cooperative model. The sight still took her breath away, this evidence that beauty could grow from even the darkest beginnings. "You're up early." Kieran's voice was soft with sleep as he approached from behind, his arms sliding around her waist with practiced ease. Even after months of sharing a bed, waking up beside him still felt like a miracle she didn't quite deserve. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, leaning back against his chest. "Today feels significant." And it was. Today marked the formal establishment of the Guardian Council, not a single bloodline carrying the burden of protecting reality, but a diverse group of representatives from every major supernatural community. The old barriers between worlds would remain, but they would be maintained by shared responsibility rather than inherited duty. Nervous? Kieran's lips brushed against her temple, the gesture both comforting and arousing in the way that had become familiar between them. "Terrified," she said honestly. "What if we're wrong? What if cooperation really isn't enough to keep the barriers stable? What if—" He turned her in his arms, cutting off her spiral of doubt with a kiss that tasted of morning coffee and absolute certainty. When they broke apart, his storm-gray eyes held depths of affection that still made her pulse quicken. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. "Just like we've figured out everything else." Everything else had indeed required considerable figuring out. Learning to balance her guardian abilities with their mate bond had been challenging enough. There were still nights when she woke up glowing with residual power, or when Kieran's alpha instincts responded to threats only she could sense. But they'd found their rhythm, discovered ways to strengthen each other, rather than compete for dominance. More complex had been navigating the political implications of their relationship. An alpha king mated to a guardian represented a fundamental shift in supernatural power structures, one that had required delicate negotiations with territorial leaders who weren't sure what this new dynamic meant for their own authority. Selena had been among the most vocal opponents initially, until the night she'd arrived at the sanctuary bloody and desperate, pursued by creatures from the void spaces that had somehow escaped Elena's initial summoning. Lyra's decision to heal her former rival's wounds without question, and Kieran's support of that choice, had gone a long way toward proving that their bond enhanced rather than threatened the stability of the supernatural community. "The delegation from the eastern provinces should arrive within the hour," Kieran said, his hands settling at her waist with possessive comfort. "Marcus is coming with them." Lyra felt her shoulders tense at the mention of her former tormentor's name. The beta who had spent years convincing her she was worthless had been conspicuously absent from the alliance negotiations, though other members of his pack had eagerly joined the cooperative efforts. "I don't need to see him," she said quickly. "I can find reasons to be elsewhere when—" "No." Kieran's voice carried the gentle authority that meant he wasn't going to budge on this issue. "You don't run from anyone anymore, Lyra. Not even him." "I'm not running. I'm just strategically avoiding unnecessary conflict." His laugh was warm against her ear. "You faced down a corrupted guardian and reformed the fundamental structure of reality itself. I think you can handle one insecure beta who's about to discover his worldview was completely wrong." Before she could respond, a soft knock at the sanctuary doors interrupted their morning quiet. Through the crystal walls, they could see a familiar figure waiting patiently. Elena, no longer corrupted, but still bearing the ethereal beauty that marked her as something more than merely human. "She's early," Kieran observed as they moved to welcome their visitor. "Actually, I'm right on time," Elena said as the doors opened at their approach. "I wanted to speak with you both before the formal ceremonies begin." She looked well, Lyra was relieved to see. The 3 months since her redemption had been kind to her ancestor, softening the harsh edges that centuries of bitterness had carved into her features. But more than physical healing, there was a peace in Elena's manner that spoke of someone who had finally laid down burdens she'd carried far too long. "How are the reformations progressing?" Lyra asked as they settled in the comfortable sitting area that had replaced the old war room. "Better than expected," Elena replied with genuine satisfaction. "We've located 17 corrupted entities so far, and 13 have chosen to accept redemption. The others..." She shrugged eloquently. "Some wounds run too deep for even guardian light to heal, but they've been contained in realms where they can't harm others, while they decide whether they're ready to change." It was more success than anyone had dared hope for when they'd begun reaching out to beings that had been consumed by darkness for centuries, or millennia. The network of cooperative guardianship had proven remarkably effective at identifying troubled entities before they became genuine threats. "And the barriers?" Kieran asked. "Stronger than they've ever been," Elena confirmed. "The shared maintenance model is working exactly as Lyra envisioned. Instead of one bloodline burning itself out to keep reality stable, we have thousands of willing participants contributing small amounts of energy. The barriers are self-sustaining now, fed by the collective will of everyone who benefits from them." Lyra felt a warm glow of pride at the confirmation. It had been her idea, born from the desperate moment when she'd realized that protection didn't have to be a solitary burden. But implementing it had required the cooperation of beings who had spent millennia viewing each other as enemies or competitors. "There is one concern," Elena continued, her expression growing more serious. "The increased stability has attracted attention from elsewhere, realms that exist beyond our local dimensional cluster. Some of them are curious about our methods. Others..." She paused meaningfully. "Others are less pleased about the changes we've made." A chill ran down Lyra's spine. They'd been so focused on reforming their own corner of the multiverse that she hadn't considered how those changes might appear to entities operating on an even grander scale. "Threats?" Kieran's voice carried the dangerous undertone that meant his protective instincts were engaging. "Not yet. But we should be prepared for diplomatic contact, let's call it. Beings who want to understand what we've accomplished here, and whether it represents an opportunity or a problem for their own interests." Before anyone could respond to this ominous news, the sanctuary's early warning systems activated. Through the crystal walls, they could see the Eastern Province delegation approaching. A mix of wolves, humans, and other supernatural beings traveling together in the kind of cooperative group that would have been unthinkable under the old system. And at their head, looking older and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him, walked Beta Marcus. "Ready?" Kieran asked, offering her his arm with the same gallant gesture that had started their relationship all those months ago. Lyra took his arm, feeling the familiar surge of strength that came from their bond, and smiled. For whatever comes next, always. But as they moved to greet their visitors, she couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's warning about attention from distant realms was going to prove prophetic sooner than any of them were prepared for. The new age they'd built was about to face its first real test from forces that operated on a scale they'd never imagined. And somehow she suspected that everything they'd accomplished so far was just the beginning of a much larger story. Chapter 13. Facing the past. The Great Hall had been transformed along with everything else in the sanctuary, its stone walls now translucent crystal that allowed natural light to flow through while maintaining the sense of ancient strength. Long tables arranged in concentric circles replaced the old hierarchical seating, symbolizing the equality that underpinned their new alliance. But as the Eastern Province delegation filed in, Lyra couldn't help remembering the last time she'd stood in this space, trembling with a wine tray, convinced she was nothing more than a broken Omega serving her betters. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now stood at the head table as an equal partner to the Alpha King, her guardian abilities making her one of the most powerful beings in the supernatural world. Yet the moment Marcus stepped through the doorway, some part of her wanted to fade into the background, to become invisible the way she'd learned to survive his casual cruelties. Kieran's hand found hers under the table, his thumb tracing soothing circles on her palm. Even without words, he could sense her emotional turmoil, their bond allowing him to offer strength when she needed it most. "Breathe," he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. "You're not that frightened girl anymore." She wasn't. Intellectually, she knew that. But, watching Marcus approach with his familiar swagger diminished by obvious uncertainty, she realized that some wounds took more than power to heal. The beta who had once seemed like an insurmountable force now looked smaller, older. The confidence that had made him so terrifying to a grieving 18-year-old was nowhere to be found as he took in the transformed space and the impossible mix of species gathered peacefully around the crystal tables. "Your Majesty," Marcus said with a bow that was technically correct, but lacked the fluid grace that marked truly comfortable pack dynamics. "Thank you for allowing us to participate in these unprecedented negotiations." "Beta Marcus." Kieran's voice was politely neutral, but Lyra could feel the predator beneath the diplomatic facade. Her mate hadn't forgotten the stories she'd shared about her years with Marcus's pack, and his protective instincts were very much engaged. "I trust your journey was uneventful?" "Yes, though." Marcus's gaze swept the hall again, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "I admit I had difficulty believing the reports we received. Vampires and fae working alongside werewolves, humans contributing to supernatural governance. It seems impossible?" Lyra spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the way her pulse quickened when Marcus's attention snapped to her. "I suppose it would, if you're used to thinking in terms of rigid hierarchies and fixed limitations." The beta's face went through a fascinating series of expressions as he truly looked at her for the first time. Gone was the submissive, broken girl he'd known. In her place stood a woman who radiated quiet confidence, whose very presence seemed to make the crystal walls glow brighter, whose connection to the Alpha King was so obvious it practically hummed in the air between them. "Lyra?" His voice cracked slightly on her name. "But you were an Omega who couldn't shift?" She smiled, and there was nothing cruel in it, just the gentle amusement of someone who had moved far beyond the need for petty revenge. "Yes, I was." It turns out that wasn't the limitation we all assumed it to be. One of Marcus's companions, a younger wolf Lyra recognized as David, who had been among the few pack members to show her basic kindness, stepped forward with obvious wonder. "The stories we've heard," David said, his eyes wide. "About guardian magic, about the network you've created. Is it true that you can actually sense threats from other dimensions?" "Among other things," Lyra confirmed. She raised her hand, and golden light danced between her fingers. Not the desperate energy she'd once wielded in life-or-death situations, but something controlled and beautiful. "It turns out that being unable to shift isn't a defect. It's just a different kind of gift." Marcus stared at the display of power, his face pale. "I don't understand. The tests we ran when you were younger were designed to measure werewolf abilities, Elena interjected, materializing beside their table with the ethereal grace that marked her as something beyond ordinary existence. Guardian magic operates on completely different principles. Your tests couldn't detect what they weren't designed to recognize. The introduction of Elena, identified as the founder of the sanctuary and one of the most powerful magical beings in existence, sent ripples of awe and fear through the Eastern Province delegation. Several of them dropped into instinctive bows, while others simply stared with the fascination of people encountering legends made flesh. "This is Elena Thorne," Lyra said, her voice carrying the warmth reserved for family. "My great-great-grandmother and the architect of the original barrier system. She's been helping us establish the new cooperative model." Marcus's legs seemed to give out. He sank into the nearest chair, staring between Lyra and Elena with dawning comprehension. "Thorn," he whispered. "The bloodline we thought had died out. The legends about guardians maintaining the barriers between worlds." His eyes snapped back to Lyra. "You're not just a guardian. You're the last guardian. The most powerful magical being in generations. And we treated her like garbage," Kieran finished, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. "Convinced a grieving teenager that she was worthless. Made her believe she was broken when she was actually awakening to abilities your pack couldn't begin to comprehend." The Alpha King's presence seemed to expand, filling the space with the kind of authority that made lesser predators remember their place in the food chain. Several of the delegation members stepped back instinctively, recognizing the signs of a truly dangerous alpha on the edge of violence. "Marcus," Lyra said quietly, and somehow her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Look at me." The beta raised his eyes reluctantly, bracing himself for the reckoning he'd probably feared since the moment he'd learned the truth about what she'd become. But instead of anger or condemnation, he found something that shook him more profoundly than rage ever could have. He found forgiveness. "I spent years hating you," Lyra said simply. "Years believing that your treatment of me defined my worth. But hatred is just another kind of cage, and I've learned that I prefer to be free." She gestured to the transformed hall around them, to the impossible cooperation between ancient enemies, to the living proof that change was not only possible, but inevitable. This alliance exists because we chose to believe that beings could be more than their worst impulses. That redemption was possible even for those who had caused tremendous harm. Her smile was gentle, but implacable. "I can't very well exclude you from that possibility just because your cruelty was personal." Marcus's composure finally cracked. Years of suppressed guilt and shame poured out in a broken sob that echoed through the crystal hall. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, Lyra, I'm so sorry. You were just a child, grieving and alone, and I made everything worse because I was threatened by something I couldn't understand." "I know," she said simply. "And I forgive you." The words seemed to hit him with physical force. He doubled over, shoulders shaking with the release of burdens he'd carried without realizing their weight. Around the hall, the assembled delegates watched in amazement as this private drama played out on the public stage. But more than mere spectacle, they were witnessing a demonstration of the principles that underpinned their new alliance. The radical idea that transformation was always possible, that mercy could be stronger than vengeance. "However," Kieran added, his voice carrying unmistakable steel beneath the diplomatic courtesy, "forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. The way you treated my mate has consequences that extend beyond this moment. You'll need to prove that your change is genuine, not just expedient." Marcus nodded frantically, still overwhelmed by the grace he'd been shown when he'd expected, and perhaps deserved, retribution. But as the formal ceremonies began and the business of alliance building took precedence over personal reckonings, Lyra couldn't shake Elena's earlier warning about attention from distant realms. Because if beings from beyond their dimensional cluster were indeed taking notice of their reforms, then the delicate peace they'd built was about to face challenges that made pack politics look simple by comparison. The hardest tests, she suspected, were still to come. Chapter 14. Whispers from beyond the formal ceremonies had concluded hours ago, but Lyra found herself unable to settle into the celebration that followed. While delegates from across the supernatural world mingled in the transformed Great Hall, vampires sharing centuries-old stories with Fey nobility, werewolf alphas comparing territorial management strategies with dragon clan leaders, she stood on the sanctuary's highest balcony, studying the night sky with growing unease. The stars looked wrong. Not obviously so. She doubted anyone without guardian abilities would notice the subtle shifts in stellar patterns, the way certain constellations seemed to pulse with energies that had nothing to do with nuclear fusion. But to her enhanced senses, the very fabric of space around their dimensional cluster was unsettled, like reality itself was holding its breath. "You feel it too." Elena's voice carried no surprise as she materialized beside the balcony railing, her ethereal form more translucent than usual in the moonlight. "What exactly am I feeling?" Lyra asked, not taking her eyes from the disturbing display above them. "Because it's like the universe is trying to tell me something, but I don't speak the language." "Contact," Elena said simply. "Beings from the outer reaches testing our boundaries, trying to understand what we've built here. Some are merely curious about our cooperative model. Others..." She paused meaningfully. "Others view change as inherently threatening." A chill ran down Lyra's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "How dangerous are we talking?" "That depends largely on how we handle first contact." Elena's expression grew distant, as though she was accessing memories that stretched across eons. "In my original research before the corruption, I found references to entities that exist on scales we can barely comprehend. Some guard the fundamental laws that keep the multiverse stable. They tend to react poorly to what they perceive as unauthorized alterations to reality's structure. And our reforms definitely qualify as unauthorized alterations," Lyra said grimly. "Spectacularly so." Elena's smile held grim humor. "We've essentially rewritten the basic operating principles for our entire dimensional cluster. The ripple effects are spreading outward at the speed of causality itself." Before Lyra could respond, warmth pressed against her back as Kieran's arms encircled her waist. Even 3 months into their relationship, his presence still had the power to steady her when everything else felt uncertain. "Plotting the overthrow of cosmic order?" he asked lightly, though she could feel the tension in his embrace. Their bond meant he was aware of her unease, even if he couldn't identify its source. "Just contemplating the possible consequences of our spectacular success," she replied, leaning into his solid strength. "Apparently, reshaping reality tends to attract attention from interested parties." Kieran's arms tightened protectively. "What kind of interested parties?" Elena turned to face them both, her expression serious. "The kind that could unmake everything we've accomplished with a thought, if they decide we represent a threat to universal stability." A new voice joined their conversation from the balcony entrance, Marcus, looking haggard but determined as he approached with obvious reluctance. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once defined him. "But there's something you need to know. Something that happened during our journey here." Lyra felt Kieran go still against her back, his alpha instincts recognizing potential danger. "What kind of something?" "We weren't the only delegation traveling to the sanctuary tonight," Marcus continued, his eyes darting nervously between them. "About 50 miles out, we encountered others. Beings that claimed to be observers from the Cosmic Oversight Council." Elena went rigid, her ethereal form flickering with alarm. They made contact directly? That's unprecedented. The council operates through intermediaries, never shows themselves to local entities. Well, they showed themselves to us, Marcus said grimly. 3 figures in what looked like living starlight, speaking in harmonics that made our teeth ache. They asked detailed questions about the changes here, about Lyra specifically. Ice formed in Lyra's veins. What kind of questions? Whether you were acting under your own will or external compulsion. Whether your reforms represented evolution or corruption. Whether you understood the broader implications of what you were doing. Marcus's voice grew quieter. And whether you would be receptive to guidance from entities with more experience in multiversal management. That's not good, Elena said flatly. When the Cosmic Oversight Council starts offering guidance, it usually means they're preparing to intervene directly. Intervene how? Kieran's voice carried dangerous undertones. By imposing their own version of order, Elena replied grimly, which typically involves rolling back any changes they deem destabilizing, regardless of local preferences or the benefits those changes might provide. The implications hit Lyra like a physical blow. Everything they'd built, all the cooperation and healing and hope they'd fostered, it could all be swept away by beings who saw their reforms as threats to some larger cosmic balance. There's more, Marcus continued reluctantly. They left us with a message. They want to meet with Lyra directly within the next lunar cycle, to evaluate her fitness to continue wielding guardian abilities on this scale. Evaluate, Lyra repeated, the word tasting like ashes in her mouth. As in, decide whether I'm allowed to keep my powers. As in, decide whether you're allowed to keep existing? Elena corrected harshly. The Cosmic Oversight Council doesn't make idle threats. If they deem you a destabilizing influence, they'll remove you from the equation entirely. Silence fell over the balcony, broken only by the distant sounds of celebration from the great hall below. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Lyra. On the very day they'd formalized their alliance and proven that cooperation could triumph over centuries of division, forces beyond their comprehension were moving to tear it all down. So what do we do? She asked finally, surprised by how steady her voice remained despite the terror clawing at her chest. We prepare, Kieran said grimly, his alpha authority filling the space around them. We learn everything we can about these Cosmic Oversight Council entities. We shore up our defenses, and we make sure that whatever evaluation they have planned doesn't catch us off guard. Preparation may not be enough, Elena warned. The Council operates on scales we can barely comprehend. If they've decided our reforms represent a threat, then we prove them wrong, Lyra interrupted, feeling familiar fire begin to build in her chest. We show them that change doesn't have to mean chaos, that cooperation can be stronger than control. And if they're not interested in being convinced? Marcus asked quietly. Lyra looked out at the strange stars, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being the linchpin of their entire alliance. Hundreds of beings downstairs were celebrating a future that might be snatched away by forces they'd never imagined existed. Then we fight, she said simply. Not because we want to, but because what we've built here is worth protecting. Because the idea that beings can choose to be better than their nature is too important to let die without a struggle. Kieran's arms tightened around her, and she felt his absolute support flow through their bond. Together, he murmured against her ear. Together, she agreed. But as they stood on the balcony watching reality itself seem to shimmer with cosmic attention, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges lay ahead. They'd reformed their local corner of the universe, but the universe, it seemed, had opinions about unauthorized reforms. The next lunar cycle would determine whether their dreams of a better world would survive contact with forces that viewed change itself as anathema, and whether love really could triumph over cosmic indifference. The celebration below continued, but the weight of impending judgment hung over them like storm clouds gathering on an impossible horizon. Time, as Elena had warned, was running out. Chapter 15. Beyond the Stars. The lunar cycle had passed too quickly and not quickly enough. 28 days of frantic preparation, of researching entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension, of strengthening bonds that might be all that stood between their world and cosmic annihilation. Now, as the full moon rose over the sanctuary's crystal spires, Lyra stood in the heart of the transformed chamber surrounded by everyone who mattered most to her. Kieran at her right hand, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. Elena floating nearby, her ethereal form crackling with defensive energies centuries in the making. The core alliance members, representatives from every major supernatural community, formed protective circles around them, their combined power creating layers of shielding that made the air itself hum with potential. Even Marcus was there, positioned among the outer defenses with grim determination. His redemption remained a work in progress, but his loyalty to the cause they'd all sworn to protect was absolute. "They're coming," Elena announced unnecessarily. Everyone could feel it now, the way reality seemed to bend and stretch as something vast approached their dimensional space. The crystal walls of the sanctuary began to sing, harmonics that spoke of forces operating on scales that dwarfed solar systems. The first sign of their arrival was the way the moon stopped moving. Not gradually, not with any apparent cause. One moment it was following its ancient path across the star-scattered sky. The next it hung frozen like a pearl suspended in cosmic amber. The effect was so fundamentally wrong that several of the younger wolves whimpered with instinctive terror. Then the stars began to rearrange themselves. What had been familiar constellations shifted and flowed, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Big Dipper became a spiral that seemed to descend into infinite depth. Orion's belt stretched into a bridge that spanned impossible distances. And through it all, 3 points of light began to descend, not falling, but approaching with the inevitability of gravity itself. "The Cosmic Oversight Council," Elena whispered, her voice tight with recognition. "In all my research, all my centuries of existence, I never thought I'd see them manifest directly." The 3 lights touched down in the sanctuary's central space, and reality adjusted. The chamber expanded without growing larger, accommodated presences that existed in more dimensions than human perception could process. When the radiance faded enough to allow vision, 3 figures stood before them. Beings of living starlight wrapped in forms that suggested, rather than depicted, humanoid shapes. When they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that resonated in the bones, in the soul, in the fundamental frequency of existence itself. Lyra Thorne, guardian of the northeastern dimensional cluster. The words weren't heard so much as experienced. "You have been summoned for evaluation." Every protective instinct Lyra possessed screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything except stand calmly before entities that could reshape reality with a thought. But she'd learned something important over the past months. Sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was simply be yourself, completely and without apology. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady despite the cosmic forces pressing against her consciousness. "What do you need to know?" The central figure, if such terms applied to beings of living light, pulsed with what might have been surprise. "You do not fear us." "I'm terrified," Lyra admitted honestly. "But terror doesn't change what needs to be done. You're here because you're concerned about the changes we've made. I'm willing to explain our reasoning, to show you what we've accomplished, but I won't apologize for choosing cooperation over control. The reforms you have implemented violate fundamental principles of dimensional stability. The barriers between worlds exist for purposes beyond your comprehension. Do they? Lyra felt Kieran's strength flow through their bond, steadying her as she prepared to argue for everything they'd built. Or do they exist because that's how things have always been done, and no one questioned whether there might be better ways? She gestured to the assembled alliance members, to the impossible mix of species that had once been enemies now standing united in common cause. Look at what we've created: vampires and werewolves working together, humans contributing to supernatural governance, Fey nobility collaborating with dragon clans on environmental restoration. We've taken beings who spent millennia at each other's throats and turned them into partners. Temporary cooperation born of novelty. Such alliances have been attempted before. They invariably collapse into conflict. Then why haven't ours? Lyra challenged. It's been months since we established the alliance. According to historical patterns, we should have dissolved into chaos by now. Instead, we're stronger than ever. The second figure stepped forward, its starlight form pulsing with what might have been curiosity. Explain the mechanism of your success. Love, Lyra said simply, and felt the cosmic entity's surprise ripple through dimensions. Not romantic love, though that has its place, but the love that says every being deserves a chance to be more than their worst impulses. The love that chooses to see potential instead of limitation. She held up her hand, letting golden light dance between her fingers, not as a threat, but as demonstration. Guardian magic was always about protection, but we misunderstood what needed protecting. It's not about keeping different worlds separate. It's about protecting the possibility that they can coexist peacefully. Idealistic, impractical, evolutionary pressures ensure competition, not cooperation. Do they? Kieran spoke for the first time, his alpha authority adding weight to his words. Because our bond proves otherwise. I'm the strongest predator in this dimensional cluster, and my mate is the most powerful guardian in generations. According to evolutionary logic, we should be competing for dominance. Instead, we make each other stronger. The third entity moved closer, its attention focused on the visible connection between them, the way their energies intertwined and amplified each other. Unprecedented. A guardian alpha bond should not be possible. A lot of things we've done shouldn't be possible, Lyra agreed. But impossibility, it turns out, is just another word for nobody's tried it yet. Elena drifted forward, her ethereal presence adding its own testimony to their defense. I spent centuries believing that power corrupted, that cooperation was impossible, that the only choice was between order and chaos, she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. But my descendant showed me a third option, transformation. Not destruction of the old ways, but evolution beyond them. The cosmic entities conferred in harmonics too complex for mortal minds to process. When they spoke again, their collective voice carried notes of something that might have been wonder. The dimensional barriers in your cluster have not weakened despite your reforms. They have strengthened. Because they're maintained by choice now instead of compulsion, Lyra explained. Thousands of beings contributing willingly instead of one bloodline burning itself out in isolation. The barriers aren't just stronger, they're more stable, more adaptive, more responsive to genuine threats. And the entities from void spaces that have been redeemed are some of our most effective guardians now, Elena said with quiet pride. Beings who understand darkness intimately are uniquely qualified to recognize it in others. Reformed wraiths have become some of our most successful counselors for troubled entities. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across galaxies. Finally, the central figure spoke again, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested deep contemplation. The Cosmic Oversight Council exists to maintain universal stability. We intervene when local changes threaten the greater structure of reality. Lyra's heart clenched with fear. This was it. The moment when beings beyond imagination decided whether everything they'd built would be allowed to continue. Your reforms represent the most significant dimensional restructuring observed in this galactic sector. They should have resulted in cascading instabilities, barrier collapse, interdimensional warfare. But they didn't, she said quietly. No, they did not. Instead, you have created a stable cooperative model that appears to be self-reinforcing. The three entities moved closer together, their starlight forms merging into a single radiant presence that spoke with unified voice. The Council has deliberated. Your reforms will be permitted to continue. More than that, they will be studied. If your model proves viable long-term, it may be adapted for other dimensional clusters. The relief that flooded through the sanctuary was palpable. Lyra felt her knees go weak with the sudden absence of cosmic threat, but Kieran's arms caught her before she could fall. "What does that mean for us?" she managed to ask. "It means, Lyra Thorne, that you have accomplished something we did not believe possible. You have proven that love is not merely a local evolutionary anomaly, but a fundamental force capable of reshaping reality itself." The merged entity began to fade, its starlight presence growing more ethereal as it prepared to return to whatever realm housed the Council. "Continue your work. Prove that cooperation can triumph over entropy. Show the universe that change does not have to mean destruction. And know that you do not work alone. The Council will be watching, supportively." With that, the entities dissolved into points of light that rose through the crystal ceiling and disappeared among the stars. Slowly, the moon resumed its ancient journey across the sky, and the constellations returned to their familiar patterns. In the silence that followed, Lyra found herself surrounded by everyone who mattered most. Kieran's arms around her, Elena's proud smile, the Alliance members who had stood ready to fight cosmic forces for the chance to keep building something better. "So," Kieran said eventually, his voice rich with affection and amazement, "we just convinced entities older than galaxies that love is a fundamental force of nature." "Apparently," Lyra laughed, feeling giddy with relief and possibility. "Who knew that being broken would turn out to be exactly what the universe needed?" "You were never broken," Elena said firmly. "You were just assembled differently. Built to see possibilities where others saw limitations, to find connection where others saw only division." As the celebration began around them, beings from dozens of species sharing joy that transcended all boundaries, Lyra reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them to this moment. From broken Omega to cosmic reformer, from worthless servant to the mate of an alpha king, from isolation to the center of an alliance that was reshaping reality itself. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Now we keep building," Kieran said, his arms tightening around her. "We prove to the universe that what we've started here isn't a fluke or an accident, but the beginning of something greater than any of us imagined." "Together," she said, the word carrying the weight of promise and possibility. "Always together," he agreed. And as the sanctuary filled with laughter and hope, and the kind of joy that came from knowing impossible things were not only possible but inevitable, Lyra understood that this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. The first chapter in a story that would span dimensions, transform the very nature of existence, and prove once and for all that love, in all its forms, was indeed the most powerful force in any universe. The broken Omega, who had once served wine in humiliation, had become the guardian who served hope to the cosmos itself. And she had never been more whole.